Should we open it up to your good selves? Any questions for the panel, or any thoughts, comments on what we've heard this morning? Where should we go? Start there and work around that. There's a woman there. Then we'll start over. Then go over here. Then go back there.
Hi. Thank you very much to the panel for the presentations this morning and the discussion. I was wondering if I could ask about national level NGOs and civil society organisations, because these are a very important independent voice in identifying inequalities and in holding governments to account. And some of the points made in the panel do refer to these, but I noticed that they weren't in the diagram at the beginning or in the video. So I wanted to ask whether there was a reason for that, and also is there a sense that the role of civil society has changed in holding governments to account?
Could you put that to Will directly first, because it was his slideshow?
Sure. Okay, so civil society obviously has an important role to play. One of the reasons that you didn't see them in the animation there was partially because we ran out of space to talk about all the different actors. But the way the report is constructed is each chapter asks really 3 questions, right? So instead of asking parents, how are parents holding governments accountable, we're asking, what is the parents' responsibility in the parents and students chapter? How are they held accountable? And then what do they need to meet their responsibilities? So instead of everything, every chapter pointing at what they can do to hold government accountable, it's really looking at how are parents held accountable, how are teachers held accountable, how are schools held accountable. And that's a very different approach to most research and reports on accountability. Civil society, you'll see a lot of them and their important role to play in the government chapter because they have a really important role, especially through media, to hold the government to account. And so, for instance, we know in the Philippines, we know that volunteers help through civil society, looked at monitoring, I think, 7,000 textbook delivery points, which ended up reducing cost by 2/3 and procurement time in half. And so, in addition, going through media is important, galvanizing public interest. So in Brazil, over 3 million people took part in public consultations for their education plan. A lot of that was supported by civil society. So they have an important role to play in really galvanizing public support, identifying corruption, and helping, helping build capacity in governments.
Okay. Take a question here from a colleague in green.
Actually, is that on? Yeah, it was exactly the same question because, I did some research with UNESCO in 2015 and the role of civil society and I guess a lot of people in this room are from civil society organisations and from national and international coalitions. So that was the same question. Also, my other part of the question was about rights and human rights. And I think you said, Will, that in 55% of cases, then you can hold a government accountable legally. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about kind of human rights frameworks and how they can be used at different levels, and also to support parents to understand more about the right to education.
Okay. Do you want to very quickly say that one? I've got a particular question.
Sure.
About the human rights thing?
Yeah. And so when we think about human rights, the report starts with the right to education and starts the government chapter with the government being the primary duty bearer for the right to education. We have somebody from the Right to Education Initiative in the room, so I'll let her expand on this a little bit if she is up to it. But really, when you talk about it, there's multiple ways to get the right. So you start with an international commitment, and so we talk about legally binding international commitments on the right to education, and that's the 100% that have ratified at least a treaty that has to do with the right to education. It may not be a full commitment, but it's at least education freedom in their country. And then we talk about disability, and so Tanzania is an interesting example of this where, and I've just learned this really over the last couple of years. Before I was here, I was working on the Right to Education Index. So in Tanzania, you look at their constitution and it says, okay, here's the right to education. It's easy to pick out. And then right around that, you say, well, this is not a justiciable right. And it just kind of blew my mind. And so part of that is just transitioning, saying, okay, well, we need to have something that is a protected right that citizens can act on. And so that's part of why we have 100% that have committed it. We have, I think, over 80% that have it in their their constitution, but from that 80, there's this huge gap still with people that have it in the constitution but actually can't take them to court. Okay. So that's the base piece, but there are other ways to look at this through providing action. We talk about parallel reporting. So CSOs, another way that civil society can take part is by providing parallel or shadow reports to international treaty bodies when the country is going reviewed. There are citizen complaint mechanisms to, for instance, the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education, where citizens or communities can actually go directly to UNESCO and talk about violations there as well. And I know that other NGOs and CSOs are trying to provide information campaigns to really bring that to the community level. So there's lots to it, but I'll let some others in the room.
We're also, as well as being in the room, we're online as well, and hello to our virtual audience up there. And they're sending in questions on this thing here. So there's a question here which I'll ask the panel, which is from Shwalin Patel. And the question is really, how do you measure things which are harder to measure? If you have an accountability framework, what does that do for things like people learning to live together and competencies like empathy? How do you measure empathy? Actually, Susan, how would you have a sort of score chart for empathising?
Yeah, I think there's to kind of take that from a global perspective and some of the ambition of SDG 4, which includes elements around education for peace, learning to live together, education for development, and other efforts around frameworks like this. I think that is it's a perennial question of how does one measure those elements so that they so investment and emphasis can happen on them. And I don't, I'd be interested to hear more from Mike. I think it's such a live question. From a data perspective, what have you seen done here in the UK?
Can you measure those things which are very important but not necessarily easy to count?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with the view that says just because it's hard to measure doesn't mean we should give up and only measure things that are easily measured. And in fact, there's some quite important research over the last 2 or 3 years in the UK showing about the impact of schools that are doing things with building resilience and work with mindfulness and areas like that. I'm thinking, for example, of one primary school up in the northeast of England, in Stockton. The head there talked about, I was at a conference, and she talked about a student who just left her to go to secondary school, and she said, I think she'd be the first one that survives in secondary school. And what she meant by that was the previous two in the family had lasted 2 years and 1 year before they'd been excluded. And she said, we think she will be okay because we've done a lot of work in helping our students be emotionally prepared for transfer to secondary school. Now, measuring that is quite tricky, but it's actually really quite important. I think things can be on maybe at a more, when I say a local level, a school level, things like that. I was interested when you mentioned about Chile, that initiatives were happening in sort of almost small scale locally and building up in some ways, the impression I got with some of the things you mentioned. I'm thinking of a school up in Sheffield where they identified it's essentially things to do with mental health issues is important. Now, it's hard to measure that, but referring through the local authority was taking a long time. So they made a decision that rather than spending money on some other things, they'd spend some money on having a permanent psychiatrist employed in the school that worked in their school and in their primary schools, and they got pupils supported and referred to much quicker. They turn out, the reason I identified that school, I was doing one of the research things I do is looking at trying to find schools who are doing very well with pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they'd been the fastest improving and were doing best in terms of progress of disadvantaged students. That was one of the things they put down to that. So I think it is difficult to measure. Another school example is one where I was looking at schools in the UK have to report on essentially performance with disadvantaged pupils. It's a big government target, reducing the gap between disadvantaged pupils and others. There's extra funding for that, and schools have to report on that. It's quite salutary to look at school websites and see how they are reporting. I looked at a sample of schools where the gap is still very wide and not closing, in fact getting even wider, and generally there's one page that says this is what we've done, and there's nothing where they talk about evidence of impact. Schools in the middle have a little bit about impact. Almost all of the schools that have had a big impact, where that performance of disadvantaged pupils has been improving rapidly, what they report on their website is only maybe about 20% of the report is about what they did, and 80% is about impact. And I think one of the most interesting ones said they'd looked at performance of disadvantaged pupils in terms of the progress they were making. They also looked at the gap in pupil attitude surveys. And that was a school that was going into real depth and using that data diagnostically. And surprise, surprise again, they were one of the fastest improving with those sort of students. So I think there is a lot of merit to doing it. It's probably quite a hard thing to think of how you do it at a sort of national level and defining it.
It's the very heart of accountability, doesn't
Yeah,
it? Because
but
what you choose to
yeah.
measure is a decision in itself, isn't
But
it?
again, maybe, I sometimes wonder why the same accountability method and measurement has to be used in every context. We've said it doesn't apply across countries. Why does it apply within countries? Schools are in different situations, and the sort of methodology and data analysis that needs to be used for accountability maybe should vary according to their context.
Okay. Well, park that thought for a second. There were some questions over this side of the room which I haven't had a chance to. There was a man right at the back who was very early on. Could you also say your name perhaps and what brings you here as well, who you might represent if you were from an organisation?
All right. I'm Abdul M. Fatoma from Campaign for Human Rights and Development International. We operate in Sierra Leone, and which happens to be my home country. And we're talking about accountability. It is a huge challenge for our civil society organization operating in Sierra Leone, raising issues ranging from accountability. Like one of the panelists was saying, there are frameworks, there are, rules, and we are part of the International Treaty on the Covenant on, Anti-Corruption, and we have the Anti-Corruption Commission in Sierra Leone. And happens to be a victim. I was arrested and detained for 24 hours. My passport was confiscated for 45 days for raising serious accountability issues in Sierra Leone. Regarding the money that our parliamentarians receive for social development issues. And some of these social development issues links to education. And in another development, 11 students were arrested after we raised issues dealing with anti-corruption, about corruption, in the education sector, that the corruption is crippling the education sector in Sierra Leone, where we have a Minister of Education had served more than 10 years, and the educational system in the country going down the drain. These students were denied the right to education for the whole of semester, a university, Jala University from the south. And these students were out demonstrating for the government to pay their lecturers so that they will go back to the classroom and match with their counterpart in the country. 11 of them were arrested. And, our organization was at the middle of it to get them released as well, whilst I was on bail and my passport seized, So talking about accountability and what can motivate us. And we have countries that has the laws, but they don't want to respect these laws that they are signatory to or the laws that they have passed.
How do you
what support?
Just sorry to interrupt you, but how do you want to put that right? What would the international community would you like it to do to make those laws enforceable?
I think the UN that comes up with more treaties and just morally binding, I think there lies the problem. Because some of these politicians or civil servants working in those countries that we can consider highly corrupt, and they use the law against people who challenge, the corrupt system. They think that, legally they will not be, punished. There's no punishment for them, but morally, people will frown at them. So I think the international community really needs to think about some of these, serious issue to bring out, serious legally binding enforced punishment, for state parties that violate, some of these treaties' right, to their citizens.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that sort of a real-world example. And there's a woman here, two speakers here, and then the man in purple. And if you say who you're from and everything.
Hi, I'm Julia McGowan from Handicap International. I'm an inclusive education technical advisor, so my focus is on inclusive education. So you can probably guess my question. We've touched on it a little bit, but I noticed that throughout the report I've seen so far, there hasn't been so much of a focus on inclusive education, even though SDG 4 does have inclusive education in the title, and it's inclusive quality education. I'm always seeing it reduced to quality education, which obviously is important, but it is about inclusive quality education. And I know we touched on a little bit from what you were saying, Mike, in fact, on the disadvantaged groups in the UK and what they've been doing here. And I think that there's a lot of things that actually address some of the questions you raised earlier on what else to measure, how to measure empathy, all of those things. Actually, if you're looking at inclusive education and targets for that and how to monitor that, is actually looking at those things, looking at the attitudes, looking at issues around how do we address mental health, how do we address other disabilities, other challenges that children might face. We're not just talking about children with disabilities, although I think that is the biggest group of children who are out of school, so I think it's important to mention that when we're looking at out-of-school children. But, it's about the broad spectrum and how those children are addressed and how the education sector plan is accountable to those groups.
Great, thanks. And should we take the third question as well? We'll take them as a group so we can get them together.
Thanks very much. Sophie Edwards from DevX. I've been writing quite a lot about Liberia, and so I wondered if you guys had some views on the PPP structures. Yeah. And also the issue on accountability in Liberia was possibly some suggestions were, could somebody like the World Bank come in and provide an accountability mechanism, because the government doesn't have the capacity. So when you need something to come in fast, are there any alternatives to sort of having government as the main accountability?
Okay. Should we take those three together? And they're quite big topics. So we've got corruption, inclusion, and the experiment in Liberia. in one sentence, 5 seconds. Choose any 5 words.
Yeah, I did talk about at the very beginning how complex the issue of accountability is, and it really, really is. I'll mention inclusive education. I think it's interesting that we hadn't mentioned we did mention this, and I think in the sense that a focus on equitable education is really front and center in the report. I think where we come at that question from ODI's perspective is a real focus across the SDGs on leave no one behind. And so I think that emphasis on inclusive education is really embedded into now global frameworks focused on education. But it's about achieving it's not there just because it's from a rights perspective or because it's the right thing to do. It's about achieving the targets and the goals as well, because unless you're really focusing on that group that needs to go the last mile, you're not going to be achieving the SDGs. And so I think it's a fundamental element. Liberian PPP structures, I am an observer more than anything on that. And so I think there are some people in the room that might even be able to comment in more depth. I find it a very interesting experiment. I think that there's lots of questions about, again, because of some of the contextual issues we've talked about, how valid that experiment would ever be elsewhere and how valid it's going to be in Liberia in the long term because of resource availability and capacity. And I think the question about supporting accountability structures for a government is a really interesting one as well. And I guess the thing that I would say about that is, as kind of shown in this report, supporting accountability structures really needs to go beyond the formal mechanisms and the formal structures to be thinking about systems as a whole, and goes beyond the role of central government, but all the different layers of actors that need to be involved.
Okay. You bring Will in, because the Liberian questions about the idea of using private providers in a sort of competition to see who can deliver better results. Is this the future? Are we looking at something that will be used elsewhere? What's the view of the monitors on this?
Well, we're keeping tabs in Liberia, but probably not an expert on what's going on in Liberia. But I think, from our understanding and my understanding, I think what's happening in Liberia is a pretty unique case when we think about the state of the public education system in Liberia, and really the needs they have and the resource constraints they have. So my take for accountability purposes in Liberia is really a push to make sure that before the experiment expands, that we really do our job in making sure we have adequate evidence to make sure that we're not leaving people behind, that we're not pushing students out of schools, and that we have equitable access to high quality education throughout all. And then I also agree with some of Susan's concerns as far as resources. And what does that mean down the road? Right now, I know some of the private providers have a lot of external resources coming in to support them, and I'm not sure that's sustainable. So I think understanding...
Is it a kind of fork in the road, though, between what you might think of as being a development approach and something which is saying, you tried that, got nowhere, here's a whole lot of money, we're going to just do it as a private sector approach? Is it a one or other, or are these things which are complementary?
I mean, I think in the long run, we're talking about student learning and students' access to high quality education, right? So I think for us, that would mean that we want to make sure that all students have access to high quality education, and that schools, regardless of whether they're public or private, are really meeting regulations that are focusing on the rights of the child in there. And so, I think the report's perspective, we see the long-term, real sustainable solution is public education, but in some situations, this might be a short-term way to help strengthen the capacity of the government to where eventually they're the one providing high-quality education. But I think, basically going back to some of the concerns on data and how do you measure it and stuff, I think there needs to be a more holistic approach to, like, what data are we gathering, what evidence do we have in Liberia? We need to wait for that to come forth before we really decide to put more money into something that we're not entirely sure how it works.
Okay. Watch this space then.
Yeah.
There were some more questions, weren't there?
Sean, could I
Okay, yeah, on the...
pick up on the sort of inclusivity side
Yes,
and equity? And I guess it particularly made me think of perhaps an area which I think in some ways we could regard as quite a success story for the UK, and it links in some ways to use of quite sensitive data. And that's essentially the performance of students for whom English is additional language, and particularly immigrant students, over the last sort of 20 years in the UK. I mean, they've improved significantly faster than white pupils. I know part of that is you can link back. There was a question earlier on about civil society and parental attitudes and expectations. You can link a lot to that, but it's a lot of work that schools have done. But I actually think how much of that would have happened if we hadn't been collecting nationally data about students' ethnicity and using that to help identify and target support. How much of that improvement would have happened had we not been doing that? Because the references in your report, Will, to the sensitivity of collecting data like that, and that's well understood. If you look at UK data, a lot of children who maybe parents put them down as being Roma in primary school are suddenly no longer Roma in secondary school, and that's because they're worried about being bullied. So they switch what they describe themselves as. So there are immense sensitivities to that. But on the other hand, maybe that data used properly and to target can actually have quite an impact.
Okay. No, let's get some more questions in, because we're running out of time. So there's a man at the back, and we've got a whole raft of things. So let's try and keep a little bit, we're just conscious of time running out. And there you go.
Hi, Sebastian from Save the Children. I guess my question is about sequencing or prioritization. So we talked about a lot of different accountability channels and mechanisms. Are there ones which should be prioritized because they can have greater effect, or should be done first because if you do others first, you get perverse incentives?
What do you think? What should be the priority?
No idea.
Admire your honesty. And can we get to a whole... There's a man here waiting very patiently, and then at the back.
Thank you. My name is Steve Packer, ex-DFID and GMR, but a very long time ago. I think many congratulations to the team. We've talked about accountability, but we shouldn't forget that they're also trying to monitor this myriad of indicators. So it's a twofold challenge with relatively limited resources. A couple of comments. One is, I think you must have wrestled with trying to reach those recommendations at the end of the document. I think it's narrowed down too much, and that relates to Susan's point about complexity and context. When I look at the triad of recommendations right at the end, I see statements that I've seen for the last 15 years, basically, with minor linguistic changes. They find themselves in an accountability framework. They've previously found themselves in policy frameworks. They've previously found themselves in resource frameworks. So there's a little bit of me that's rather depressed by a list of statements that are coming back at us, and what does that tell us about the progress that's being made? Second, quickly, if you analysed Vietnam and South Korea and some of the high performers in East Asia, would their accountability systems match the injunctions in the report? And finally, quickly, a different question. The GEMR is a part of international accountability systems. It gets its mandate from the 230 development framework. But I'm very unclear as to where it sits within SDG reporting mechanisms overall. Are you the point of first resort, or are you part of a wider set of mechanisms?
Okay. Thank you for all those. We'll leave the technical points to later, perhaps. And there's a woman just there in front of you there, and a man at the back, and then, so you three there. So, yeah.
My name is Yue Yihua. I'm doing a PhD on teacher accountability at Cambridge, and my question is also about the triad of recommendations, but from a different angle. So the recommendations here on information, resources, and capacity, but I noticed that in the main body of the report, it mentions a fourth element, motivation. And I just was curious about why there weren't any recommendations about motivation. And I understand that it's challenging both because a lot of motivation is rightly context-specific, and also because when you say accountability and motivation, the instant association is performance-based pay and punitive sanctions. But is there not a danger on it just dropping out of consciousness if it's not put on the agenda as prominently as the other elements?
So do you think it's too negative? There should be positive rather than negative?
Or just that, I'm just wondering about the decision to not include motivation on the list here when it was included as a component of the effective accountability system.
Okay. And there's a man just behind there, and then who's just at the back.
Hello, hi. My name is Luke Stannard. I'm working with Save the Children at the moment. We're working on a report in EdTech in education and emergencies, so I just wanted to talk up for that sort of slightly muddied area between development and what we're looking at here, or the other way around, so it was. But we have a problem that we have a huge proliferation of private sector engaging in the education and emergency sector. We talk to them about accountability. We're trying to encourage greater accountability in short funding cycles. Tends to scare people off. So how do NGOs they're arguing that we're standing in the way of them engaging because we're asking them to produce measures of accountability and how they're improving learning outcomes. So what would your recommendations be for how we negotiate?
No, it's a big question, isn't it? And finally, there's a woman there who's been waiting.
Thanks. I'm Elaine On Charter from UCL Institute of Education. It's a kind of development of Sebastian's question about prioritization. The diagram is very flat. So the government, schools, pupils, which is probably intentional around wanting to privilege context. But the question I'm asking is wondering about is how you'd manage trade-offs, and are there particular norms of accountability that you think would need to drive how you would deal with the prioritization or sequencing? Is equity a norm? Question mark.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, we're right out of time. And what I think we should do, maybe taking your theme about where do you start, what's the priority, and also our colleagues from Save the Children over there, what are the priorities? Should we take that as a final question to our panel, and then we'll take some of the other ones as comments, because they're raising huge topics about how you spread the net of accountability over so many different things. Should we just take that? What would you make your priority from today's report? What would you think, if you had to tell people there was one thing from this that they should think about and focus on? What would it be?
I think accountability needs to be looking at holistic systems, and I think the question of sequencing is maybe a misdirection in the sense that that you really have to look at a context as a whole and at the different layers of actors. And I think a mistake, and possibly why recommendations look similar as they might have 15 years ago, is because there hasn't been that kind of holistic analysis of what needs to happen in terms of accountability and engagement, not just in a formal structure of regulations, but also the underlying dynamics and the motivations that are there. So I think my takeaway would be a holistic system approach to accountability.
Okay. Mike, what would you say? What's your...
Two thoughts. One, I'd just go back to that thing I opened up with about remembering the headline about humility within the context of accountability. And I guess if I could, I suppose, simplest way is end with a plug for something that my colleagues at Data Lab were involved with. And I can speak dispassionately about this because it was Becky Allen and Dave Thompson that have worked with Head Teachers Roundtable on this. I haven't been involved. But Head Teachers Roundtable have published, I think, some very interesting documents talking about where UK should go next in terms of school accountability. And it says lots of really interesting things.
What's most, if you had one takeaway from what would it
It's about finding ways for accountability to encourage cooperation rather than competition between schools.
Okay. Will, final word to you as the author.
Well, first, I want to encourage, so the video you saw and the diagram with all the different actors, I think it's interesting to see the range of actors involved. When we talk about actually how accountability works, when you get to the full report, look up page 14 and figure 1.2, because that really talks about the four pieces here on resources, capacity, information, and motivation, and how that really works in with the interdependence of actors. So I think, where do you start? I think actually you start with trust. Like there are countries that do a good job of building trust, and there are multiple layers of trust. You need to have trust in the person. You need to have trust in the profession. When we think about teachers, we need to be building trust in teaching profession. And then you need to have trust in the process. And part of that trust starts with including all the important stakeholders in the development of some of these policies. So when they conclude it, they are more likely to actually believe that it's a just and effective process. So I think trust is incredibly important.
Okay, trust. We'll end on the word trust then. Thank you very much. And to our virtual audience, big apologies for lots of questions we haven't had time to address, but they're all in here and we've read them. And thank you for all of you for having so many thoughts, and apologies for people who didn't get a chance to speak, because I think there probably we could have gone on a bit longer. But can we give a round of applause to our panelists? And also the invisible report team who are listed at great length in here, who have produced all this work. I'm sure if they're watching in Paris, thank you very much for all their hard work. And thank you. And thank you very much for coming.